Welcome to this media briefing on the response of the global biopharmaceutical industry to COVID-19. Journalists, thank you so much for joining us. You will have received a link. Please click on it and you can write your questions in the chat box. You can also join us in about 20 minutes over Skype. We're going to take 20 minutes because we want to hear from the CEOs and the experts about how they are responding to this global public health emergency, whether it's in terms of diagnostic treatments, vaccines, diagnostic testing as well. So let me present our speakers. First of all, we have Dave Ricks, who's the CEO and chairman of Eli Lilly and Company, and who is the president of the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Associations, IFPMA. And Dave is joining us from Indianapolis in the US. Paul Stoffels, who is the Chief Scientific Officer of J&J, Johnson & Johnson, and he's joining us from Beersay in Belgium. Thank you. Rajiv Venkaya, who is the President of the Global Business Vaccines Unit at Takeda. Takeda, a global biopharma company in Japan. Rajiv is joining us from Boston in the US. And we have David Lowe, who's the Executive Vice President of Sanofi Pasteur. And David is joining us from Lyon in France. And we have Severin Schwan, who's the CEO of Roche and who's the Vice President of IFPMA. So gentlemen, thank you for joining us from all of these different locations in the world. And I'm delighted that in the studio here in Geneva is the Director General of IFPMA, Thomas Cooney. Thomas, let me start by just asking a question to you. What has struck you most about the response to this pandemic so far?
There are a number of things. One is we are dealing with a truly global public health threat with major impact of countries affecting. And it's one which I think nobody in my generation can recall. We see an unprecedented rapid response from WHO, governments, the biopharmaceutical industry, and many others. And we see that we are all in this together, both professionally, but also personally. I think it's amazing how far we have come in 2 months. First, we benefited from the extremely rapid sharing of the genome sequence of the novel coronavirus, which helped to develop tests, but which also helps to test medicines and develop a vaccine. Second, luckily, we can build on the lessons learned of recent virus outbreaks such as SARS, MERS, Zika, or Ebola, and the testing of medicines or the development of vaccines will not totally start from scratch. And finally, we have learned that the response to such a pandemic outbreak requires leadership and partnering, involving WHO, governments, international and national agencies such as CEPI, but also the private sector. And that's what we have seen develop over these 2 months, everybody understanding we are not really in business as usual.
Yes, we're all trying to find the solutions to this crisis. Thank you, Thomas, very much. Let me go to Dave Ricks there as the president of IFPMA. And yeah, it's the question everybody wants to know. What can we expect from the pharmaceutical industry?
Well, thank you for the question. And as Thomas said, we are living in unprecedented times. Just 8 weeks ago, we began to hear about a virus that has now essentially turned society upside down in most of the world. The pharmaceutical industry is responding accordingly, really with 3 key things: our technology, our teamwork, partnership around the world, and with the timeline by which we're moving. On technology, we have 3 work streams happening across the industry. The first is the reliable supply of the diagnostics, vaccines, and other therapeutics we already make, many of which are directed at populations at high risk for COVID-19 mortality and morbidity. We need to supply those effectively and making sure that our plants and our testing continues. to support patients around the world. The second thing is redirecting technologies toward this problem, maybe existing medicines and development in the pipeline or existing testing platforms that could make a difference. There's been a donation of libraries, tremendous effort across companies and with third parties and NGOs to stand up those efforts and already begin screening compounds that could have efficacy against the virus. And we all know there's a few companies testing existing medicines in phase 3 studies already, which could read out within weeks. And then finally, creating new medicines, new vaccines, new tests that will aid in extinguishing COVID-19 for good. And these efforts have begun very rapidly. They are across the industry. There are literally dozens of them. I want to comment also, though, on the teamwork and the timeline. In my career, I have never seen the kind of collaboration across industry partners, but also with biotech, academia, and governments that I'm seeing today. And the timeline by which we're moving is truly remarkable. Just in days, we're seeing regulators approve studies. Just yesterday, the US started with a biotech company, a vaccine trial. Things are moving fast, and they need to, because this is a dangerous threat that needs to be extinguished. We are committed today, that's the purpose of the briefing, to play our part and do it in a robust way to bring the full force of our scientific expertise to this problem.
When you say in a robust way, what does that mean for the issue that's always asked, which is about affordability and pricing?
You know, to be honest, that's a question we expect, but I've been spending really the last 4 weeks of my life working on COVID-19 related issues with partners who are on the phone here today, as well as many, many others, government agencies, et cetera, and in our own labs. I've yet to hear a single person ask the question, who will get credit or how will we get paid? That's just not the issue we're working on now. I'm sure it'll work its way out, but our industry stands ready right now to solve the problem. That's what everybody I know working in the industry is focused on, and that's what I'm focused on.
Dave, thank you very, very much for those comments. Of course, what everybody is focusing on, as we've heard from the Director General of the World Health Organization this week, it's all about testing. And he said, you cannot fight a fire blindfolded. And everybody wants to know about these diagnostic tests. So Severin, Roche, you produce many medicines, but you've been working on diagnostic tests. So I think you're the person to ask this question about how can these tests be increased and speeded up?
Thank you. Indeed, testing is very important these days. It helps us to isolate infected patients, to flatten the curve so that healthcare systems can cope with their capacities. But I should also say, whilst the industry has been ramping up production and as more testing capacities are provided, still the demand is by far outstripping the supply. So it is very important, in my view, and I speak here on behalf of many experts, that testing is really targeted for high-risk patients and patients who show signs and symptoms of the disease. Broad-based testing at this stage is simply not feasible. As far as the ramp-up of the capacities is concerned, we have seen big progress. I'd like to echo something which Dave Ricks has already referred to, and that is the collaboration with other companies, and importantly, the collaboration with external partners, authorities, and the regulators in particular. Just to put this into perspective, we have started our ramp up of diagnostic tests on high throughput platforms in January, we have developed such a test for high throughput platforms in an absolute record time. And just to open my bracket, it's very important to have those tests available on highly automated platforms. First, because you need the number of tests going through the system, but also because there is less manual input needed from lab staff, which is, of course, a very valuable resource these days. But we have developed that in record time, and there would have been no way to develop this so fast without the close cooperation with the authorities. In the US, for example, we were working hand in hand with the FDA, the approval agency, and within 24 hours, we got emergency authorization to make this test available for patients. This is absolutely unheard. Typically, this would take months under normal circumstances. So I'm really, really impressed in terms of how people come together here within the industry, but also beyond, as we work together with external partners, regulators in particular.
Severin, thank you very much. Yes, indeed. Unfortunately, the virus is racing at unprecedented rates, but also so are the pharmaceutical companies and the regulators. And as you mentioned, you have got one of those tests out there already. Thank you. Let me bring in Rajiv from Takeda. A medical background, I understand you trained in pulmonary care, and we heard Dave Ricks talk about flattening the curve. What is your view on flattening the curve, given that this virus is progressing at such a fast rate, and where do you think we should be focusing our efforts?
Well, the flattening the curve strategy is very, very important. In fact, when I was working in the White House, we first conceived that concept of coordinated community-wide interventions to dampen the transmission of a virus in the community. And we've seen that this has been taken up around the world in this pandemic to varying degrees, but it has not been sufficient. And so my greatest concern at this point is around what I would call the healthcare surge, the requirement for hospital beds, and not just beds, but also healthcare workers who are appropriately protected and healthy and able to be in the workforce. And here is where we need to have effective therapeutics, drugs and biologics, other medicines that can treat the critically ill individuals, but also prevent infection in healthcare workers who are at greatest risk for infection. Here at Takeda, we are leveraging our plasma-derived therapies capability to develop an antibody preparation, an immunoglobulin preparation that concentrates antibodies against coronavirus. This is taken from or derived from plasma taken from recovered patients that have had coronavirus infections. And we believe that within 9 to 18 months, we could have a product that has real potential to treat the most critically ill patients. But many companies are doing exactly this kind of thing at light speed. What we need to have is very good clinical trials to quickly test these evaluations in a clinical environment and give us good data on whether or not we should use these therapies and when.
Rajiv, thank you very much for that contribution. And what we've been hearing also from Thomas and Dave Ricks is about using these existing technologies and know-how and repurposing. So let me bring David Lowe, Executive Vice President of Sanofi Pasteur, into the conversation. Why then is there no vaccine waiting on the shelf to create, to be used when COVID-19 was discovered?
So, thank you, Claire. Vaccines, the viruses have a tendency to mutate. And when they mutate, they can sometimes go unnoticed, or they can become very harmful, like we have with COVID-19. When you develop a vaccine, you have to tailor make it to the circulating viruses. We know it from flu vaccines, where we re-engineer the vaccines every year because they change season by season. And COVID-19 is such a mutated virus inside of the coronavirus family. So we are now accelerating our work in terms of trying to develop as quickly as we can a very specific vaccine to COVID-19. There is a second aspect, which is we need to also ask ourselves as a society, are we well organized enough in terms of how we set up the mechanisms of working together? And I have to say, for example, an institute like BARDA in the United States certainly helps to foster these preparation activities. Again, after the so-called swine flu, you remember, which started in Mexico at the time, there was a very quick mobilization. And today, these kind of institutions like BARDA has helped to start preparation activities for these big threats. Corona is, of course, one of those, but pandemic flu is certainly also another one.
And just tell me, I'm sure it's the question that the journalists will be asking, and we're going to take some journalist questions in a moment, but how long do you think it's going to take to get a vaccine and to get it to the people in need? We're hearing lots of different timelines. What timeline can you give us?
So the good news is that there are already one candidate in phase 1 clinical trial. There are multiple other candidates shortly behind that. Of course, developing a vaccine, we can try to go very fast, working with regulatory authorities, compress the timelines instead of having a meeting, when you ask for it, having a meeting in 2 months, you now can get meetings extremely quickly from FDA or EMA. So you can cut on those kind of administrative timelines. What we will not have to sacrifice is the determination is it efficacious and safe, because vaccines need to be safe. They are typically injected in healthy people, so we need to ensure the safety. So our timeline estimation is it's going to take 12, 18 months at the minimum until you have a registered vaccine available on the market.
David, thank you very, very much for that contribution. And in fact, David was referring there to BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, all about the collaboration. And let me bring in Paul Stoffels, who's the Chief Scientific Officer of J&J. We may need a number of vaccines, we may need a number of treatments. So can you just give us a brief overview of how the industry and the public sector is working together?
Well, the industry has the technology which has to be deployed, and especially in these circumstances, starting from existing infrastructure, existing know-how, you get the fastest to a new therapeutic or a vaccine solution. And that's also what we're doing, where we work on the one hand, getting into drugs on our existing platforms as well with a vaccine. And what David was just saying, 12 to 18 months is what the minimum need is to get there. But if you can build on experience from the past, and what we can do is build on the Ebola experience, the Zika experience, HIV experience, you plug into a system which has already been tested, and you know day by day, hour by hour in that next year what you have to do in order to get the results. The same for medicines. Where we work together is specifically on how can we get as fast as possible to clinical trials, and that's with the regulators, but also with the clinical community. If we need to test this, then we need to prove the efficacy and safety. We have to get around the world where the epidemic is happening, and we'll need to be able to plug in, collaborate with all these clinical teams, academic or hospital teams, to get to the outcome for that. And then working day by day, hour by hour, the speed to get the data and to get to approval. So it's a large collaboration effort. As well as in these times now, when we have to get to products, we need the supplies for all of the disciplines. It's not just one pharmaceutical industry who will do this. It's a combination of many working together with the best possible efforts on either on the research, but also on the supply chain, sharing capabilities, sharing manufacturing capacity in order to get there. And that's a normal for us to do at this moment in time, combating together for solving COVID-19.
Paul, thank you very much for your contribution. Yes, indeed, it's a collaborative effort. And I'm now just going to ask for some very quick comments about some of the challenges and the business challenges from our speakers before opening up to the journalist. And Severin, of course, you were talking to us about diagnostic tests. You produce many other medicines, and I'm wondering about business continuity here. Are you able to secure supply of all of your medicines and tests for everyone, given that borders are closing? Are there any risks to your supply chain, is what I'm really asking here.
Well, we are carefully monitoring the related risks. What I can say for our company and what I hear from other companies is that for the time being, the supply chains are up and running. And whilst, of course, the free movement of people is more and more restricted around the world, actually governments and authorities have recognized that global supply chains are absolutely critical to keep supply up and running. I can speak for my company, and I know this is very much the case for many other companies here around the table and other companies. That we depend on international supply chains. If you look at diagnostics, just to give you one example, I mean, you need an instrument on which you can run the tests, right? Then you need the test itself, the reagents, the assays. And then you need a third component, which is consumables, plastic parts, for example, which are just necessary to run a test. So you need three components to do a test. Now, our test, which is now provided worldwide, is produced in the United States. The instruments are produced in Switzerland and the consumables are produced in Germany. So if you wouldn't have an international supply chain here, nobody in the world could actually do testing. So it is absolutely critical that we keep the borders open for medicines, for medical devices. And I should say that is the case because authorities have recognized how much we all depend on a global collaboration to keep supply going.
Severin, thank you very much. Let me just direct that question also to Dave from Eli Lilly about business continuity. Are there any concerns as far as you're concerned where you are?
Well, speaking for my company, but I think also the whole of industry, we view one of our primary responsibilities, as I said, is to supply the technology, the medicines, the vaccines, the testing that we already have approved for other diseases to support the healthcare system. In our case, for our company, for instance, we're a primary manufacturer of insulin, which is required for life for people with type 1 diabetes. So we're taking that responsibility extremely seriously. We've done everything we can to secure the supply chain, and we're very confident in our ability to supply. But Severin raised one issue, which is very important, which is the movement of goods. And I think as global air travel is dramatically reduced for passenger travel, that also reduces freight availability. And we do use air freight quite a bit in the pharmaceutical industry. We need help to make sure those lanes of movement remain open, not just at the border, but between the borders with shipment. Two other risks I want to highlight, which could be a well-intended effort by local governments to quarantine or restrict movement of their citizens. We do need to classify everywhere in the world the pharmaceutical industry as an essential industry to maintain the ability of our workers to get to the plants. That has been a hiccup in a few places, and I just want to emphasize that here. And then finally, it's important that we don't have an environment where one nation or one city or one region seek to possess more medicines than needed. The supply chain is built for the global consumption. And if we can get our workers to the plants and the materials can move, we will be able to fulfill global supply on all these essential medicines. If we restrict and hoard medicines, either at an individual level, within a chain of drugstores, or at a country level, that will severely hamper the ability of people in need to get what they need, essential medicine. So I just want to emphasize those points, that we keep borders open, that we allow workers to get to plants, and that we just use what we need during this essential time.
Dave, thank you very much. Points well taken, I am sure. Let me move to David from Sanofi Pasteur, because there are going to be industrial challenges, aren't there, also in developing the COVID-19 vaccines?
That's absolutely correct, Claire, because when you think about how many people we will want to vaccinate once we have a vaccine around the world, we're talking billions. And that's a huge challenge. So we are looking at alternatives. Where can we produce? How can we produce our vaccines? Is there a way we can leverage, for example, adjuvants, which boost your immune system in combination with the vaccine, because then you might need a bit less of the vaccine since you're priming the immune system. And those kind of questions we're working through. Where I'm working right now in the industry on capacity available, but it's very positive to see that there is a strong collaboration ongoing and a strong openness to try to make it happen.
Thank you very much for that. And Rajiv, when we're talking about collaboration, of course, you're also an independent board member, as I understand it, of the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, CEPI. It's been in the news a lot because of some of these vaccines that are starting to go through clinical trials. I mean, can you very, very briefly just talk to us about collaboration with CEPI?
Well, CEPI is an organization that was launched in 2017 for the purpose of developing vaccines against viruses with epidemic or pandemic potential. And you could say that CEPI is the perfect organization to be coordinating vaccine development activities for this pandemic. Within weeks of recognition, in fact, days of recognition of this virus, they initiated vaccine development programs with a number of companies. And what CEPI is going to do is partner with all of the relevant regulatory authorities, governments, as well as with companies themselves to speed the availability of vaccines. Now, there's no way to shorten certain requirements to test for safety and effectiveness. And so the timeline that you heard earlier of 12 to 18 months is very aggressive, but we think it might be feasible. One very important concept that is central to CEPI is access, which is to say that if we develop effective vaccines and hopefully drugs and therapeutics, that we will find a way to ensure that they get to everyone who needs them. And this is one of the guarantees that CEPI is providing for the government-funded programs that it is supporting, that it will prioritize access and equity in the distribution of those vaccines.
Rajiv, thank you very much for that. And Paul Stoffels, I know that that's also a question for you about access and also getting any treatments that are developed to low and middle income countries, Africa. You referred to it in your opening remarks. How much of a challenge do you see this being?
Well, we have done this before. This is not the first time that, like for example with HIV, the world find a solution that everyone who needs access to the current HIV drugs gets it. Yeah, and so with Ebola, in the current Ebola epidemic, it's all about access. It's even not about affordable because the products are available for people and for the countries at no cost at the moment. So every time we find a solution, in this one, it's absolutely access, availability, and affordability in the end. The first objective now for all of our industry is making sure that we get this under control with accessible technologies. And that's what David was saying. On the quantity which is needed this time is like unprecedented, and our industry will have to work together across all the different partners here to make sure that enough capacity is available, if a vaccine is there, that everyone can get vaccinated to be protected.
Thank you very, very much, Paul. Now we're going to go to the journalist questions online, and we have about 45 minutes, journalists. We have received some already in writing. Then I will go to those that are appearing in the chat box. And if anybody likes to dare to be on Skype and in vision or audio, then please do use Skype. You will need to say who you are and which outlet you come from. from. So I'm going to start with a question which is actually for Paul. Now, this is from John Miller, the Reuters correspondent in Zurich. And Paul, what he's wanting to know is this. Given apparent failures, including lopinavir, ritonavir treatment in showing improvements beyond standard care, do you see any hard evidence so far that would point to using anything more than standard care of intensive care unit patients with COVID-19 outside of the trials currently underway?
Well, there has been a lot of discussion in the last few weeks about the use of HIV protease inhibitors. We also ourselves, we have a compound which is an HIV protease inhibitor available in the market today, Prezista. And we know from our scientific work that there is no activity on COVID-19. We are still continue to do testing, and we are having a clinical trial ongoing. But from the basic research work in the lab and from the structural work which we have done on the virus as well as on the medicine, there is no activity of HIV protease. It's not generalizable, but it's highly unlikely that there is any benefit of protease inhibitors for HIV on top of standard of care. And it should be proven first before it's used, because people will be deprived, HIV people will be deprived from medicines if it is used in a not necessary way in this COVID-19 epidemic.
Thank you. I can see, Rajiv, you're nodding your head here. If, Rajiv, you would like to add anything to what Paul has just said.
I think what Paul is pointing out is that there are many hypotheses about what might work in severe COVID disease, but we need to have data before we apply these hypotheses in practice, and that requires high quality, rapid clinical trials and data to inform our decision making. We don't have evidence that something beyond standard medical care in the ICU is going to be efficacious, but there are a lot of trials that are underway now, and people are hoping that we will be able to identify something or a combination of things. But it's important to point out that in intensive care units around the world, we do have a lot of experience in taking care of persons with what we call ARDS, as well as cytokine storm from a variety of causes, including severe pneumonia, like this one. And that is a very good standard of care. We hope that with time and data, we'll be able to add other tools to that approach.
Thank you very much, Rajiv. Now, John Miller from Reuters in Zurich has another question for you, Paul, from Johnson & Johnson. Has it been sobering so far how elusive this virus has been in evading treatment efforts? And if any of the other gentlemen would like to add anything to this, but the question was directed to Paul.
Well, I think the virus is not getting around any treatments. This is a new virus. There has never been therapy for this type of virus. So, and never a diagnostic, never a vaccine, never therapy. Some viruses who are close to this, like SARS, back now almost 20 years ago, was the first virus which had similar symptoms and similar origin, but at the same time, it was very lethal, but much less transmittable. This virus is extremely transmittable, and that's what is so new. So it's a new virus which needs new tools, and that's where we have to start from scratch on our research based on current platforms. We can start building, but it's a new virus, and that's where we have to do all the work.
Right, and in fact, this picks up on John Miller from Reuters' second part of his question. He mentioned, of course, that efforts, as you say, for coronavirus vaccine, SARS and MERS, didn't make it to the finish line. Why, if at all, will this situation be different? Does industry have a commercial incentive for this, given so little is known about this new virus, or whether it will re-emerge or become endemic? Paul, if you have a further comment, or any of the other gentlemen, I will throw that to you. Let me go to David Lowe.
My previous comments is...
Yeah. Oh. Absolutely, Paul. Thank you very much. I can see that David Lowe, Executive Vice President of Sanofi Pasteur, would like to say something in response to that question from Reuters. David.
You know, we have seen cases like with SARS or with Zika, where a disease came, it peaked and disappeared. And that belongs to the usual risk-taking, I would say, the industry is assuming, but that is also why public-private partnerships can play a role here, so that the risk is kind of split. And I think that's a very important function of these collaborations between different institutions and also public research, because sometimes the risk is so high that nobody wants to embark. So I think it's important that we reflect about this. On COVID-19, there are these partnerships already starting to be established, and they're certainly going to be helpful in these kind of situations. The big question comes when it is about gearing up production capacity and at what time, because there is a big portion of risk involved in that. So either you already have an existing platform and then you can ramp up relatively easily, or you don't have that and then it gets harder.
I have just seen also that there's a question from the Financial Times. If somebody, yes, Camilla Hodgson, which David, I think might be for you, the Financial Times in London, and Camilla is asking, from what you've seen so far, what is the most promising cure, treatment or vaccine for COVID-19?
Well, I think on the treatment side, there are a couple of recent publications which have come out. Hydroxychloroquine, there is a very small pilot trial. It's going into larger trial now. IL-6, there was a publication in the New England Journal which could dampen the cytokine storm. In fact, we are ramping up already production because of that. That's the example that I gave you, is that it's part of risk-taking that we are doing right now. So that's on the treatment side. On the vaccine side, I think there are different technologies which are being tried. Messenger RNA is already in a phase 1 trial right now. The drawback of messenger RNA is that it has never been tested in a large phase 3 trial, so we don't know what's going to happen with these kind of platforms. There are other platforms in testing, like recombinant baculovirus that we are using, that has been tested already and registered even as a platform for flu vaccines, and we are repurposing it now for COVID-19. But it remains to be seen when we embark to the clinical trials if it's actually working and which platform is going to pan out as being efficacious and safe.
Thank you very much for that. I've got a question also from Christian Affolter of Lagerfy in Switzerland, which is the combined effort of the global biopharmaceutical industry is one good thing. But what about the delays caused by the clinical testing requirements before any treatment or vaccine can be commercialized? Will authorities facilitate and shorten this process? David?
Yeah, they clearly do. We see it with a very changed attitude of FDA, EMEA. They have a real sense of urgency. They are trying to cut down red tape. You can get meetings very fast. They allow you to do stage gate trials, where they review data while you develop drugs or vaccines. So I would really commend them for that attitude in that crisis situation.
Thank you very much for your contribution. Paul Stoffels, I'm just wondering, because we're mentioning other countries around the world, and there is a question from Hilal Sari of Dunya Daily Economics, Istanbul. Will there be technology transfer to all countries with pharmaceutical manufacturing capacities? Will the drug be allowed to be produced by countries like Turkey? Do you expect to find a solid treatment in the coming months that may save lives all around the world? Okay, there's 3 questions there, but I wonder whether you could respond to Hilal there in Turkey.
Yeah, I can give a response to many of the technologies are very high-tech systems at the moment, which will require a lot of time to transfer technology. So what we have to do today is using existing manufacturing plants with partners, with trained people. If you want to produce a vaccine in 12 to 18 months from now, you have to start from existing technology, existing plants, existing people who know what they do, and that will allow us to go fast. It's at this moment, it's not adequate to go and transfer technology while we are still building on the vaccines itself, and the same will be there for humans. So the best chance we have is work across the pharmaceutical vaccine industry, share our capacity, and make sure we make the right capacity available at the right time, but it has to be existing capacity used very adequately to upscale and deliver vaccines around the world. And that's where CEPI comes in. I think very important is that we will make sure, even if it is produced somewhere else in the world, that the vaccine will be available to every people who need it in the world. That's a promise for what we are doing jointly as an industry.
Thank you very much, Paul. Well, of course.
Maybe Claire, if I could just add
Yes,
to
of
that.
course, Dave.
Yeah, so I think the industry is committed to solve this for what will be effective to arrest the disease and extinguish it. On the medicine side, Paul was speaking to vaccines. I think it's highly probable there is capacity globally for any solution, and there may even be capacity in one company, depending on the potency of the medicines developed. So I think that's a slightly different problem, that we wouldn't want to slow things down to transfer technology, but rather just use what's there. And I think within the therapeutic side, it's a much simpler problem typically than on the vaccine side. So we don't anticipate that to be a problem. If it is, we'll do what is practical to ensure patients can globally access a medicine as quickly as possible to end the crisis.
I'm getting a lot of questions in on testing. So I'm going to direct a few questions, Severin from Roche on testing. There's a question from Svet Lustig-Vijay of Health Policy Watch, and they would like to know much more about the COBA's 680 and 880 systems. Okay, I'm going to come back to Severin, because he's here in Basel, but I'm sure he'll return here in Switzerland shortly. Please do, because there's a lot of questions on diagnostic testing for Severin. Then let me go to Birgit Voigt of NZZ am Sonntag in Switzerland. David Lowe, let me also ask you then about I see that great. I'll go to David, and Severin's still here. So David, I'm going to ask you a question, and then Severin, you've got so many questions on diagnostic testing. So please stay with us. David, let me just get your point on this question from NZZ. Lots of news about various companies who seem to promise a vaccine soon. What's your position on lowering the bars for testing and admitting a COVID-19 vaccine? How safe can vaccines derived with new technologies be?
Well, there are kind of two parts to your question. The first one is, can we lower the bar on a vaccine? The answer is no, and the reason is very simple. As I said before, you're injecting this to healthy people. So you don't want to have suddenly people getting sick because we were shortcutting certain things. So we always have to make sure that when we do the trials, they are demonstrating efficacy and safety. So no compromising on this one, because it could also have deleterious effects on other vaccines. If people lose trust in vaccination, suddenly they refuse to take other vaccines. And we know that in past times, before we had vaccines, people were dying of a lot of viral and bacterial diseases, where now we have a vaccine. So we certainly don't want to create that damage. But as I said, the regulatory authorities are cutting red tape, and that's the way how we can accelerate getting to the markets quicker.
Rajiv, I can see that you're nodding your head. Would you like to add anything to what David has just said?
Well, I couldn't agree more that we can't lower the bar on safety, and I would also say that there's been a lot of excitement about the vaccines that are going into clinical trials, including just this week, as was mentioned. But if you look across the many programs that have been launched, if you look at history, not all of those programs will be successful. And I think that is something that I don't think we've effectively communicated to the public. Just because we start a vaccine program doesn't mean that we will definitely get a vaccine on the other end. And so the value of starting multiple trials across multiple technological approaches is that you can assume that a certain proportion, even potentially most of them, will fail, but that some will succeed and get across the finish line and be licensed and scaled up and made broadly available. I think that's a very important concept we need to keep in mind when we talk about these 12 to 18-month timelines.
Thank you very much, Rajiv, for that reminder. Let me go to Severin of Roche. Let me just check whether you're on the line.
I am, yes.
He is in audio. That's fantastic. I'm glad you can hear us, Severin. This is a question from Svet Lustig, VJ, Health Policy Watch. He would like to know a bit more about the Cobas 6800 and 8800 systems cost per unit, if possible. And he'd be intrigued to know, apart from the USA, which apparently has 100 machines, what other parts of the world have these machines? And is there a plan to work with developing countries so that they can get access to these fantastic machines? Severin, did you hear those questions?
I did.
Thank you.
And I'm happy to comment on that. So you have an infrastructure around the world. On the one hand, with low throughput systems, which are more research type systems. The problem with those systems is that they're very manual and the throughput is more limited. The Cobas systems you refer to are so-called high throughput systems, and the advantage is that they are automated and have a higher throughput. I just want to reiterate what I said beforehand. We are ramping up. You can imagine we are working 24/7 to provide as many platforms out there as we can, but we are on allocation. So we can only, and we should only test for the time being people who are high-risk patients or who show signs and symptoms of the disease. There is simply not enough capacity. And as we are all aware, the incidence rates are rapidly increasing. Having said that, we are not the only company. We were the first company coming out with platforms and tests, but in the meantime, a number of other companies have got emergency approval by the FDA and other authorities around the world. So capacities are increasing around the world. We can do more testing, but it's still on allocation. So we cannot do broad-based testing. On the pricing, from a commercial point of view, let me be very clear here, this is completely irrelevant. If you look at this from a commercial point of view, and I can explicitly speak for Roche, this is completely immaterial for our commercial results. And you have to see that the cost per test is a fraction, you know, what the manufacturer gets here in terms of the financial burden for societies is a fraction of the total cost. The real cost, the vast majority of the cost for testing is the infrastructure you need in the hospitals, the personnel you need in the hospitals. That is the real bottleneck. So our concern at the moment, and also the concern of all our partners is not commercial considerations at all. It is not relevant here, not at all. It is only about ramping up capacities on the one hand and targeting the capacity which we have to those patients where we get the biggest benefit from a medical point of view.
Severin, thank you very much for that strong message. And indeed, to carry on with another question from Jenny Ravello from Devex on test kits. She says, Severin said demand far outstrips supply, indeed. Can you provide us some numbers on how many test kits are available in the market versus demand? And how does WHO validation and regulatory approvals in countries affect test kit availability, Severin?
I mean, it's very fluid and capacities are ramping up as we speak. Just this week, a number of additional companies got approval for diagnostic testing. So this is now going into the double-digit millions of tests available on a monthly basis, and it is ramping up. So that's the good news. Having said that, again, demand is also going up. So we have to prioritize testing. There was a second question. Can you just remind me what the second question was?
I will, if we can go back to the DevEx question on the screen there. There we are, yes, and it was. And how does WHO validation and regulatory approvals in countries affect test kit availability?
Thanks for reminding me. So actually the cooperation with authorities is flawless, is excellent. I have to say that around the world, companies are receiving the necessary approvals in record time. This is true for our company, for Roche. We received FDA approval, we received CE mark, and with those approvals, the tests are widely available. So regulatory constraints are not the bottleneck. It is really about production capacities.
Severin, just another question from Tamar Khan, who's a science and health writer for Business Day in Cape Town, South Africa, also for Reuters. What steps are being taken to bring down the costs of testing, particularly for developing countries?
Again, cost is not the issue. Cost is not the issue at all. The issue is capacities and access. The problem is that you need to install highly sophisticated systems in a lab environment. So this is not about the cost of the test. It is about the people, the infrastructure, the personnel, the staff, which you need to ramp up the testing. You need personnel to ramp up the testing. So therefore also the priority has been initially to provide those labs with tests who have already an existing infrastructure, because this is not tests which you could just run at home. You need educated staff to run these tests. That's where we have the biggest impact. Now, in more developed countries, we have more of the automated platforms. In emerging markets, we have to work more with the low throughput platforms at this stage. So this is where our initial focus is, to ramp up production and testing capacities throughout the world as much as we can. And in parallel, what we are doing now is gradually bringing additional instruments online to those labs who already have an infrastructure, and to additional labs where the need is biggest, so that over time we can increase capacity. Again, cost is not the bottleneck. It is about infrastructure and personnel, which is the bottleneck at this point.
Thank you for making that message very clear. Tamar has one more question, which is, who owns the intellectual property rights on COVID-19 tests?
There's no IP. This is publicly available IP. This is not protected. So any company which has the capability can develop such a test. And indeed, we have a number of companies who are ramping up their testing capacities. So intellectual property for diagnostic testing is no constraint in this specific situation.
Severin, thank you very much for those very emphatic answers there. I'm going to take some questions from Denise Rowland from the Wall Street Journal. The first one I sense might be for David Lowe. It's, if an effective vaccine therapy is found, how will you decide how to prioritize supply? Do you anticipate some kind of global lottery or allocations per country based on need? David, I can see at the moment, if you were able to answer that, and then perhaps Dave Ricks, who alluded to that in one of his first answers, might want to say something too. So David Lowe, Executive Vice President of Sanofi Pasteur.
Yeah, that's a very difficult question, because we will have to discuss this with public institutions on what kind of algorithm we are going to use. We have on all the vaccines always made sure that there is kind of equitable distribution around the world. I think we will have to observe how the epidemiology is going to behave. So today it's too early to speculate about this.
Understood. Dave, Rix, if I can just bring you in there, because I remember from what you said at the beginning that this is important that countries don't hoard supplies.
Right.
And I'm just wondering, the question from Denise Rowland there is, how will you decide how to prioritize supply? Do you anticipate some kind of global lottery or allocations per country based on need?
Well, I think, as David just mentioned and Severin before with diagnostics, for therapeutics as well, we'll partner with global agencies and governments to determine the most appropriate use. If there is a limitation on volume, what's the most appropriate medical use? In my personal view, this should transcend national borders. This is a human crisis, not a national one. And we would look forward to partnering as an industry with the various multilateral agencies mentioned previously to solve that problem and make sure scarce resources get to the most in need.
And thank you very much, Dave. Rajiv, also Denise Rowland from the Wall Street Journal wants to know, can you talk about the importance of developing an antibody test in order to identify people who've had and recovered from coronavirus? She says this would presumably help you identify donors. How critical is it that we have a test like this?
Well, so that's exactly right. This is very important for our program so that we know who has the individuals who have recovered from COVID illness have sufficient levels of antibody to be suitable for donation. But I would say that it's even more important to help us understand the epidemiology of this virus. There are, as you know, a lot of people who have COVID infection, or the virus that causes COVID infects them and doesn't cause any symptoms at all or causes mild symptoms. And so it's very difficult at this moment in time to calculate the infectivity and the lethality of this virus to guide our public health decision making. So having such a test, ideally something like a point of care test, would be extraordinarily helpful for public health professionals and scientists and disease modelers to generate evidence to inform public health interventions such as the one you're seeing undertaken now.
Rajiv, there's another question that I'd like to direct to you. This is from Alex Knapp at Forbes. Infected patients appear to have a wide range from responses, with 20% showing a very severe response to perhaps as many as 18% being asymptomatic but contagious. How does this wide range of patient response inform treatments, and should it inform how we approach testing if you can transmit the disease with no symptoms?
So this is the challenge with this virus, that you can not be showing any clinical symptoms. You may not even know that you have it, but there is a possibility that you could transmit it to other people. And that is why this virus has been transmitted around the world with such speed and stealth. It has been operating under the radar, as they say, of physicians and public health professionals and the general public. And so this creates tremendous challenges as we think about ways to control an infection like this. I think the deployment of diagnostic tests, when they have been scaled up, will be very important so that we can understand what is happening with community level transmission. This is happening in many places around the world already, so it's not that we need to newly discover this, and as much as important as it was several weeks ago. It will be very important, however, when we come up with strategies to remove some of the non-pharmaceutical or community-wide interventions that have been so disruptive and hopefully will be time limited. We need to be guided by data, and diagnostic tests broadly used in the community can be very helpful there.
Thank you very much.
Perhaps,
yes, of course, Severin.
Claire, perhaps just one point here in this context. So this is a real dilemma at the moment, that we have to focus testing to those people who show signs and symptoms, and at the same time we know that many people who are infected do not show signs and symptoms, and therefore continue to infect other people. And there is one expectation also related to that. As we increase the testing capacity, in other words, as we are able to now test more patients, what you will see is many more people who are confirmed as being infected. So this is a combination here. On the one hand, because infections are really increasing, but on the other hand also because we test more people, right? That's we can only confirm those cases which we have really tested. But the underlying trend which we see and the increase of curve is actually might also be, if you like, exaggerated beyond the real trend, simply because we test more people who have not been tested in the past and who haven't shown signs and symptoms.
Well, thank you very much for that rather sobering fact. Let me just take a question from Robin Millard from AFP, the French agency. If I ask Dave Ricks, perhaps with his hat on as president of IFPMA, is the industry confident that it has the money it might need in order to find a vaccine?
Perhaps some of the vaccine companies could answer that, but I think speaking broadly for diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines, this is not a capital resource problem right now. There's more of a human resource problem. Executives in our industry are I know, greenlighting and directing our scientific leaders to spend as much energy as possible addressing this global problem, and then coordinating with agencies. And it was mentioned briefly, but I want to come back to it on clinical trials. The testing itself is a complex problem because even now we see in Hubei province in China, there's almost no new cases. And I understand there's some trials that were started and are having trouble enrolling subjects. We'll really need quite a unique and rapid coordinated response to enroll subjects very rapidly in stricken zones to test therapeutics. We'll need help from the clinical community on that as well. So the problems are less financial now than coordinating and human resource problems from our perspective.
And let me throw that question then to David Lowe, whether you agree with what Dave Ricks has just said about the financing issue.
Yeah, I would agree with Dave here. As I said, the collaboration with BARDA, for example, that we have done on flu, however, was a very systematic preparation in terms of having enough capacity installed. So there are more planning aspects also which play a role in the collaboration with the public, scientific aspects where we want to have exchange and mutual collaboration. And there is perhaps on the financing side how much risk you want to take and how much capacity, for example, a public institution could reserve together with the industry. And there is a financial kind of insurance model that some nations have started to develop where it has certain financial aspects.
Yes, and
Maybe
again,
Claire,
yes, please.
Just come back to that with one final comment, because I think it's very important. We've been speaking about social distancing and the flattening the curve efforts. That's vital, so we don't overwhelm the system. I think everyone on this call believes we will be able to conquer this problem with technology from this industry. And when we do, I think one important lesson to learn is the one that was just being touched on there with the spirit of what BARDA does, which is, does the industry have financial incentives to be in prevention mode on future crises? And that, I think we've learned that we probably will look back and say we could have done more, but how to make a model whereby capacities are allocated but not used, where investment is made even with the promise of no possibility for a treatment. That would be a good case. And we face this today in the area of antimicrobial resistance, for instance, where it is a growing problem. We can see it coming, but those financial interests are not adequate today. The industry is also working on those problems. And when this one is in our rearview mirror, and I think we're confident technology will arrest this disease, we need to work on those preventative steps as well. And there, to the question from France, there are significant financial problems in how we reward and incent innovative activity.
We're getting a lot of questions on financing. So we've got one from Rui Sanya from Bloomberg Businessweek, Turkey. Will the drug manufacturers be insistent on charging high prices for the possible vaccine, or will there be a new pricing policy to make the vaccine accessible for the poor? Dave, I don't know whether you want to pick up on that, and then I'll go to David Lowe.
Yeah, I touched on this, and maybe Severin has some comments as well. I touched on this in my opening comments. As I said, I've been working on this essentially full-time for the last 4 weeks across industry and within my company, I've yet to be in a conversation about pricing or who gets credit. This is not the problem we're focused on. We have ample financial resources. We know this is the moment. This industry needs to rise to the occasion and marshal every bit of scientific knowledge and know-how we have to solve a humanitarian problem. That's what we're focused on. Now, individual pricing decisions will be up to the inventors and the manufacturers of those solutions, but I think the spirit across the industry is what I'm trying to capture, which is one of cooperation, of speed, and of applying our scientific know-how to fix the problem.
Thank you. Severin, yes, would you like to add to what Dave has just said?
Yeah, absolutely. If you look what the problem is today, it's not about commercial considerations. It's all about existing infrastructure. And I think there is a really important learning here. If you look at some of the Asian countries, they have been directly hit back with, for example, the SARS crisis, the MERS crisis. What you have seen is that those countries have started to build up a certain infrastructure to be better prepared. For example, in terms of testing, right? They had experience, they have put up an infrastructure with more decentralized testing facilities so that not everything is flowing into the hospital, which proved to be extremely valuable. And you have seen the curves in a country like South Korea and other Asian countries, which was much better under control. That was nothing about pricing of diagnostic tests. That was nothing about the cost of the individual medicine. It was a lot about providing a sound infrastructure to be ready in the case of a pandemic. And I think this will be one of the key learnings when the dust settles a bit down, when the pandemic starts to fade off, that we think hard about how can we be better prepared. And I don't think that it is commercial and pricing considerations. I certainly do not see this at the very moment. It is much more about infrastructure, people, and availability of capacities to deal with such a pandemic than anything else. And we have seen exactly that difference between some of the Asian countries and some countries in Europe and also the US.
And if I thank you very much, Severin, and if I could bring in Paul Stoffels here.
Well, I would like to add another partners to this. Is also, it's us as an industry, but it's also academic partners. It is the institutions like NIH in Europe with Dave was saying BARDA, but also in Europe, the European Commission, IMI. So many different systems are now activated on collaboration. And it's not about who invented this, who will make it. It's about getting to the result, and everyone works together here. And it's like Severin was saying, it's not about what we'll make here as money on this. It's about how can we help and can we collaborate. And I must say, it's that joint community of everyone in the scientific community working collaborative, universities, industry, government academics. In that network, we'll have to generate the science in order to get to the outcome. And we'll work together to really have the impact for the world.
Paul, thank you very much for that. There's a few questions that I'd like to direct again at Severin. They're from Ilka Koplin of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. She says, how do you think the virus is going to change global supply chains in the mid and long term as we see a shortage of other pharmaceuticals such as paracetamol, ibuprofen, as APIs are produced in Asia?
Right. I would definitely, encourage everybody not now to get into this trap and say, we have to get everything into our country and close the borders. This is an illusion. This is not possible. It's certainly not possible for smaller countries. It's certainly not possible for emerging economies, but it is also not possible for larger economies. You cannot bring a complete global supply chain into one country, and it actually would be detrimental if countries now start to close the borders. And actually, we would create more supply issues in the future if we went down this path. What is, however, important is that we have backups, that we have dual supply or triple supply, that we do not rely on one geography or one single supplier, because what we see at the same time is that we need backups. I think the industry has started to work on that. There is more of an issue with medicines which have already lost patents. There is enormous price pressure. I mean, payers have reduced prices for generics to a level which for many companies have become unsustainable. And as a result of it, many suppliers consolidated, and there have been some dependencies developing as a result of it. This is less the case for medicines which are still on patent, but beyond that, again, it would be completely wrong to fall into nationalistic behavior where we start closing the borders. That would actually disrupt supply chains and make life very difficult for everybody around the world.
Severin, I've got one more question from Birgit Voigt of NZZ from you, and then I'd like to go a question from Alex Knapp from Forbes to Rajiv. But the question from NZZ for you, Severin, is do you see off-label use for Actemra outside of China against COVID-19, and how fast can you ramp up production?
Right. So David Löw has referred to that earlier. So what we do see with certain severely ill COVID-19 patients who suffer from pneumonia is that there is an overreaction of the immune system. So there's a cytokine storm, the body overreacts, and Actemra is a medicine which dampens the immune reaction, and there's anecdotal evidence that might be helpful for patients in such situations. So the drug has been used in China, but we do not yet have clinical data, and it is now validated clinical data from randomized proper clinical trials. And that is why it is so important that we could now start a clinical trial in this field. And that's exactly what we did announce this morning for this specific medicine. We agreed with the FDA in record time. Again, an example of excellent collaboration with the regulators. I mean, this is unheard of how quickly the clinical trial could be initiated for that specific indication. But we do have to wait for proper clinical evidence before we can say whether this is really effective for those patients.
Severin, thank you very much. Let me bring Rajiv into the conversation for this question from Alex Knapp from Forbes. Some preliminary data suggests COVID-19 reinfections might happen at double-digit rates. How does this guide development of antibody therapies and vaccines?
Well, I think it's important to understand this phenomenon, which researchers are attempting to do. It's not clear whether these are actual reinfections versus the reemergence of the virus that never left versus the isolation of the nucleic acid from virus that is no longer infectious. And so I think we need to really understand whether the reinfection issue is a real problem. Based on what we see with other viruses, one would have thought and hoped that once you have successfully recovered from a SARS-CoV-2 infection, the virus that causes COVID, that you would not get reinfected. So I would say that it's still early and we need to better understand what is happening. But I think that this reinforces the importance of developing not only vaccines, but also, as you mentioned, antibody therapies, whether it be something like a hyperimmune product that we are working on, or monoclonal approaches, particularly for those who are at greatest risk. And here we would talk typically about the older adults and persons with underlying medical illness. But I want to emphasize that healthcare workers, it is becoming clear, are at high risk for getting significant exposure to virus, and potentially even outcomes that you wouldn't expect in individuals that are younger and do not have previous medical conditions. So this is a population that we also need to keep in mind and do everything we can to protect.
I think that's a very good point. And my final question to the other gentleman is one from Chris Lowe of Pharmaceutical Technology London. What measures are your companies taking to protect the health of staff working on vital research projects? Perhaps if I can ask David Lowe of Sanofi Pasteur to answer that one.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. That's actually an extremely important question. What we decided to protect our workers in research and development is to look at who is absolutely critical for a given project. And what we have done is we have asked workers which are non-critical to stay at home and only have people who are on these very critical projects, like, for example, the vaccine development of COVID-19, to really come to the labs and work there. The other ones we have decided to send home.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask the other gentleman. We still have a couple of minutes. So Severin, what are you doing at Roche to protect the health of staff working on vital research projects?
Very same policies. So we ask all the people who are not working on business critical functions where you need to be on site, which is the case in the production facilities, for example, or in the labs. We ask all those people to work from home for the sake of their own safety, but also for the sake of the safety of those people who are business critical on site. It's exactly the same policies. And then, of course, we do our utmost to protect those people who are on site with protective clothing, etc. Same policies. It's important to limit the number of people on site.
And thank you very much, Severin, for that point of view from Roche. What about Takeda, Rajiv, very quickly?
We have taken a number of steps to reduce the density of people in the workplace, but we recognize that in a number of areas that have been mentioned, like laboratory research and manufacturing, that you cannot really stop without interrupting the supply of essential medicines. The point here is that there should be ways to significantly mitigate any risk of exposure in the workplace environment. And there are many social distancing interventions and PPE interventions that can be introduced at appropriate places to make the work environment safe. So the concept here is that we don't want to put employees into a high risk situation. We want to put them into a safe situation. And by planning and implementing interventions smartly, I believe that we can do that.
Thank you very much. Paul Stoffels, what is J&J doing to protect your workers?
Well, we have extensive activity globally, and it's similar to the other companies just said. We have a daily executive committee going down to every different environment in the world, and we evaluate day by day. We maximum work from home. We maximum, of course, also continue what's needed for the essential medicines. Don't forget, there are still people having cancer, having inflammation, having all the different. We need to continue to do all the essential medicines, and we should be considered as essential workers in healthcare. As Severin was saying earlier, there is many of our people who contribute to life every day by coming to work, and should be encouraged to continue and should be protected to continue to do so. So maximum protection, but also maximum elimination, bringing people home who absolutely don't need to. And we have installed all measures for people to contribute from home. And the company is going as before but in a different way.
Paul, thank you very much. And let me give the last word from the gentlemen who are joining us from around the world to Dave Ricks. Dave, 50 minutes ago, you started answering questions for us. Could you let us know about the policy for the health of your workers at Eli Lilly and Company and your final words?
Well, we've replicated the same exact practices mentioned. I want to mention, though, maybe two other things. Many of our companies have had large deployment of people in the community to run clinical trials, to do other support activities for healthcare. And in our case, and I think across the industry, those people have also been asked to work from home to avoid unnecessary contact and certainly to avoid entering healthcare facilities. In particular, related to clinical trial monitoring and supporting clinical trials, this has been a massive endeavor because in some jurisdictions, physical visits has been required, but we've cooperated with regulators to suspend that and allow virtual visits. That's happened already in our company, along with the other measures. And I want to emphasize the continuous supply of the base medications we make as an industry. In our case, we serve 40 million people globally with chronic disease. They're at risk for COVID, and if their disease gets worse, they'll have more risk. So we need to supply those medicines. That's an essential activity, and we've gone to bare minimum staff to do it and maximum protection so those plants can keep running.
Thank you very much. And thank you, gentlemen, so much for giving us your valuable time and answering so many of those questions, so many of those pertinent questions from the journalists about how we're going to beat this pandemic. Let me give the floor to Thomas Cooney. Just ask you, what are your final thoughts on how are we going to respond to this pandemic, this global health emergency?
Thank you, Claire. I think what we have seen from the 5 executives joining us is an amazingly united front of the industry. I don't recall that the industry was as united in fighting a public health threat as here on coronavirus. Reason is we are all in this together. We're all working from our homes, we're all working remote, and be assured what we heard is we won't rest until we find a solution to lift the burden of coronavirus on our families, on our friends, on patients, on our societies and the economy.
Thank you very, very much, Thomas, for those final words. Again, thank you to our experts who've joined us from all over the world. Thank you, the journalists, also for your pertinent questions. And journalists, just to let you know that the webcast is under embargo until 1700 Central European time. That's 1200 Eastern time. And you'll be able to find the webcast on the IFPMA website, which is www.ifpma.org. Please, all of you, stay safe and stay well. Thank you.